If you take one step, then you will be a little closer to your dream than if you stay just where you are.
Welcome to Coming Home Well. I'm your guest host, Liz Booker, a retired Coast Guard helicopter pilot and writer on a mission to influence the demographics of aviation through story. As literary aviatrix, I have built a community of readers and writers around books featuring women in aviation, and have interviewed authors about their books and their writing and publishing journeys. A large portion of these stories reflect the ways in which aviation history is indelibly linked to military history. This interview is a rebroadcast of the Aviatrix Book Review podcast in collaboration with Coming Home Well. While my interviews span the diversity of aviation experiences, I hope the ones that are featured here will educate and inspire those who listen. These are human stories of grit and courage, failure and success that happen to be about women in military aviation from around the world throughout our history. Hello, I'm Liz Booker. My guest today is an award-winning historian, author, and broadcaster. She's written 3 historical biographies, including The Woman Who Saved the Children, a biography of Eglantine Jebb, founder of Save the Children, The Spy Who Loved, The Secrets and Lives of Christine Granville, who was Britain's first female special agent during World War II, and the Aviatrix Book Club discussion book for May 2021, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, a true story of soaring ambition and searing rivalry. She reviews nonfiction for the UK's Spectator and Telegraph and has given talks for TEDx, the Houses of Parliament, Royal Albert Hall, the Imperial War Museum, the National Army Museum and British Library, as well as many festivals. She has also been featured on television and radio for the BBC. You can find her at her website, ClareMulley.com. Clare Mulley, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here.
I am so excited to talk to you about this book. These women were just fascinating. Their flying was incredible. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the book for anybody who hasn't had a chance to read it yet, and then we'll get into more of a book club talk afterwards.
I think we're talking about this one, The Women Who Flew for Hitler, which is my 3rd book. And I was just astounded to come across this story. I couldn't believe this story existed and I hadn't known about it earlier. And I think that, you know, all too often there are these fantastic stories of women in the Second World War that still, you know, there's quite a rich seam that is still not yet brought to light. And I had initially thought, I was going to write about a female pilot. I was thinking about the women ATA, the Air Transport Auxiliary, who were basically the ferry pilots in Britain during the war. And there were some Americans among them. There was women from many different nations. But I know a general book had been done, but I knew one of those women, a wonderful woman called Mary Ellis, known as Spitfire Mary. She delivered about, I think, at least 400 Spitfires between the field and factory, wherever they were needed. So I was talking with her and she said, that sounds fantastic, but I've just finished my memoir.
Yes, we're going to be reading her memoir later this year.
Well, I can recommend it. I did a nice little review of it afterwards for a magazine. So that was good. And she said, well, there are lots of other women involved. What about some of the women in aerial intelligence? So I was looking at another of my heroines called Constance Babington Smith. And she was the woman that identified the V1s and V2s on an aerial photograph showing where the German proving ground was. So I got quite interested in that. There's a lot of good stories. And she's actually the aunt of a good friend of mine, another writer. So that was all looking good. And then I got into this story about Peenemünde. And this was it was on the Baltic coast. It was where the Nazi Germans developed their V1s, V2s, the Me-163, the rocket plane, and so on. And I got very interested in that. And what struck me was that one of the little dots in the aerial photograph, some of those little dots as you look down that are too small to be the aircraft, are actually the heads of the pilots, the test pilots going to work to do their jobs. And I suddenly thought, my gosh, here we have two women on different sides of the war. We've got Constance Babington Smith in Britain, and we've got Hannah Reitsch walking to work to test the ME-163, the Messerschmitt Comet, which she did at Peenemünde. And they're just, there they both are, just on opposite sides of a lens. In fact, a German lens, because Constance Babington Smith thought the German lenses were better, so she used Leica. And I thought that we could do something very interesting looking at this. But then I came across this other extraordinary woman who's really been obliterated from the history records. And her name was Melitta Schiller. She was born. And her story was absolutely extraordinary. I realised then that I had two women, that there wasn't just one famous test pilot for the Nazi regime who was a woman, Hannah Reitsch. There was actually another. And her story has been very deliberately hidden because it is very radical and controversial, and she was a resistor. Melitta is this remarkable woman because she's actually got Jewish heritage, although she herself didn't know that until when the Nuremberg laws came in, and suddenly it becomes relevant to her life. I mean, she'd been raised as a Protestant, but her father had been born Jewish, and she hadn't known that previously. And so that is very interesting in its own right. But then I discovered over the course of the war, I mean, partly she's working, she's a test pilot. She's doing this extraordinary work testing the Stuka dive bombers, but she's not just a pilot, she's also an aeronautical engineer. So unlike Hannah Reitsch, who is purely a test pilot, Melitta is also developing this stuff. I mean, these are the machines that are the Stuka dive bombers that are synonymous with the Blitzkrieg, that come down screaming at sort of 80 degrees, near vertical, and absolutely terrifying everyone below. I mean, rightly so. And she was developing a lot of their key technology, like the dive sights and the dive brakes and so on. But the reason she's doing this and then testing her own work, so she's one of the very few aerial engineers who actually then tests her own work. And she insisted on doing this. I mean, she was too important for them to really want to risk her doing this, but she insisted. And the reason was that she wanted to make sure that she was uniquely valuable to the Nazi regime, because when they discovered that she had Jewish heritage, of course, her life was at risk. And she was so valuable to them that they actually offered her something called, horrible terminology, but equal to Aryan status, which she refused to accept unless it went for her entire family. And she had 5 brothers and sisters, parents, and all of them survived the war basically because of her. But as the war progressed and she learned more about not just Nazi policy, but also Nazi practice, she realised that wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to save 6 lives, given what was happening. She wanted to do more. So she actually became involved, and she's at the heart of the most famous assassination attempt. So the bomb plot on Hitler's life. Whereas the only woman I've ever heard of previously being a test pilot was Hannah Reitsch, who was a fanatical Nazi. So here I had 2 women, both in the same role that you might imagine in some sorority, the only women in this very masculine field of flight, particularly masculine in Nazi Germany. And yet they absolutely loathed one another. All these wonderful descriptions of them refusing to have a cup of tea together and one humdinger of an argument. And the reason is because they actually got very conflicting ideologies. They're basically on opposite sides of the war. So, I mean, the hairs were going up my arms. I just knew I had to tell this story.
They're going up on my arms just hearing you talk about it. So I know that you're an historian, and I definitely want to hear a little bit more about that. But what did you know about aviation before you went into this?
Not very much, no. I mean, I knew quite a lot about the Second World War. This is my 3rd book, and the one before this had also been a Second World War story. So I knew a bit about that. I knew a little bit about aviation. My husband can actually fly a helicopter, so I kind of felt like I was married to James Bond anyhow, so that was nice. But I certainly didn't know anything about the technical side of it or whatever. But so there were 2 things here. There's the technical, but there's also this sort of sense of flight. So I did try and research both. I did, during my research, I do like to get out there and get stuck in. So I did go up in a glider while I was on holiday in France. But I probably made a mistake because I went up with a little notebook and kept looking up and down to write it all down. So I would get everything down. We had to come down quite quickly with a little blue bag. So yeah, maybe not so good. I mean, I loved it. It was beautiful to see the colours, the haze and the horizon, to feel it. And I'm so glad I did it. And it enabled me, I think, to describe it a little bit better.
Well, I want to confirm that for you because The whole time I was reading it, I was like, did she fly, or did she get all of this from Hannah Reitsch's memoirs? Because you really did capture the feeling of flight and the detail of it. The scene where Hannah goes into inadvertent instrument meteorological conditions, she basically glides right into a cloud. That was terrifying. I just feel like you captured that sense of terror. And also she had like this strange confidence that was completely inappropriate to the situation.
She had an incredible physical courage. I mean, in that moment, she just started singing and repeating her own name just to keep herself going. And I think, you can probably, especially all your readers, can identify with her at that point. But I did also, I wanted to get it right. So I spoke to a lot of people in the industry, in the sector as well. So we had a few redrafts for that. But yeah.
Well, you've done a wonderful job with it. And of course, that part is of particular interest to our audience, but so is everything else. So tell me about your path to writing history. How did you decide to write biographies?
I used to work at a charity called Save the Children, which I think also exists stateside, but it's not as big as it is over here. And I came across the story of the founder of Save the Children, and I presumed that she'd be quite a dull woman in a, brown cardigan and selling raffle tickets. And she was absolutely dynamic. She was really inspirational woman, so inspirational. Her name was Eglantine Jebb, and I've called my eldest daughter Eglantine, but only as a middle name. Seemed a bit harsh as a first name. So anyhow, so I started investigating that when I went on maternity leave. And I always love the irony, because Eglantine actually devoted her life to children's welfare and promoting children's rights. Children's rights was her own concept, didn't exist before. Children weren't really seen as full human beings in that way. They didn't have rights. Anyhow, so I love the fact that she did all that, but actually I discovered that she didn't like children. She individually, she found them very tiring and noisy and exhausting. She didn't want to be around them, and she had no interest, thank you. And I always thought it was a bit of an irony of me going off on maternity leave and taking my time to go and investigate Eglantine. And then that book came out. It was sort of a labour of love. Took some time in the evenings and, around weekends and things while I had my kids. And then amazingly, it won a prize. So I was very pleased and thought, oh my gosh, I found something I can do. So I went off and started writing my second one. So that's it really. I've never done a creative writing course. I have done 2 history degrees though. My first degree was history and politics. And then when I was writing Eglantine, I thought I don't want to do a really shit book. So I did an MA in the evenings while I was having my babies, and produced a book at the end of that. So that's what I've got really. Anyhow, it's going okay. So I'm just going to press on.
But you're not only writing books, you're also writing for the media. How did those stories come to you? Was it just through writing these books that you were invited onto BBC and to write for the Telegraph?
Essentially, it's because of the books, I guess. They've all done pretty well. So the second one, I don't know if we'll talk about a bit about that later. It's a fantastic story, but I'll save that. But that one won, it won me a Polish National Award, which actually comes with a ribbon. It's like a medal. It is a medal. It's, obviously, I never know when to wear it, but I try to wear it as much as possible because it's just fantastic. I am very proud to have received that. Because I'd written about a Polish heroine and I was slightly worried, but obviously I sort of got that endorsement. That was a blessing that I really appreciated. And so that did well. And then I've done a few other things around it because I really care about my subjects. So we managed to get a bronze bust commissioned of both Eglantine and Christina the spy. And they were unveiled. That got some press attention. And I campaigned for about 6 years and finally got an English Heritage Blue plaque, which is quite an honour over here, to go on the wall of Christina's last house where she lived. And so all of this obviously brings a bit of press attention, I guess. But also, when you publish a book, it doesn't end. You have to go out and promote it. So there's lots of giving interviews, doing a blog tour, whatever, all of that sort of thing, giving lots of talks at festivals, all of which I love getting up, as you can probably tell, and talking about things. And so I enjoy all of that and started reviewing. I don't know, I got invited to start reviewing. So I do a lot of non-fiction reviews. And at the moment, I'm the chair of the judges for a British National Non-Fiction Book Prize. They're called the Historical Writers Association Prize, which is fantastic because I've got nearly 100 books just over there, which I need to really get on with. But it's amazing because they're books I wouldn't normally turn to necessarily, some of them. And it's all broadens your perspective. It's absolutely a wonderful job. So it's fantastic.
So I want to tell everyone who's listening to make sure that you go to your website, claremully.com, because you've got all those book reviews there, especially if you like historical nonfiction. But you also, I found, have quite the sense of humor that I got reading your blog.
I think humour is really important to people, and it's important to me. And I think sometimes we write history in a very dry way. Now, I think it's really important to get your facts straight. And I spend a lot of time in the archives interviewing primary, secondary research. But I think that these lives were exciting and sometimes terrifying and sometimes fun. And humour is a really important part of our psyche and an antidote to some of those horrors. And I think it has to be represented in there. And for a reader as well, when I read, I like to have some lighter moments to just sort of revive myself, restore and keep going. So yeah, I think it's important.
Yeah, about that. So the research, you mentioned that you went gliding to get the feel for flying, but tell me more about the research for this book. Like, what does that process look like? How did you follow those breadcrumbs to get to the essential things that you knew needed to be in the book?
Well, so how do I do it? I send out emails and letters to anyone that I think may be connected in any way with this history. I mean, obviously I do my secondary research, all of the contextual reading as well, but I like to get quite deeply stuck in. And so for this book, I was very lucky. I managed to interview people on both sides of the war, veterans and witnesses and family members. And so one of the RAF pilots I interviewed is quite well known over here. His name is Eric Winkle Brown, and he was a Royal Navy pilot, and he was Britain's one of our great test pilots as well. And he actually knew Hannah before the war because he met her at the 1936 Olympics when she was demonstrating gliding. And then he saw her. She was the first woman in the world to fly a helicopter, and she was the first person, male or female, to fly one inside a building, the Great Deutschlandhalle, for the 1938 Berlin Motor Show. And he was invited out again by Goering to come and meet Hannah and see her fly the helicopter. So he went out in 1938 to Berlin, and afterwards they were both invited to Goering's flat and for sort of after show drinks party. And at some point, Goering got out his pistol and invited his guests to partake in his favourite party game, which was shooting at a target painted on the wall. But actually, it had to be harder. They had to do it looking in a mirror on the wall, shooting over their shoulders. And both Hannah and Eric Brown were very short. I don't know if that helps with test piloting, to be quite lightweight, doesn't it? Anyhow, they couldn't see in the mirror, but he wouldn't let them off the hook, and he just went and got his shaving mirror, and they had to do it that way. So it meant that Eric sort of got to know Hannah before the war pretty well. And then right at the very end of the war, he actually identified her for the American forces coming through who wanted to interview her for her knowledge on dynamic aero developments that were being wind tunnels and testing the ME-163 and all the rest of it. So he actually found her and identified her and got to interview her right at the end of the Second World War. And it's this extraordinary interview because she was very emotional at the time, and I think a bit off guard. And so it's very fascinating and revealing. And then he knew her after the war because they both took part in international, flying competitions and so on. And in fact, one of the last letters she wrote to him, and it was a fascinating letter, but I won't give that away. So I interviewed him about 4 or 5 times, and I got to know him quite well. He was lovely. He had a lovely Scottish accent. He would phone up and say, "I've got something else for you, darling." And, he was absolutely brilliant. But the last time I met him, he shook my hand and said goodbye. And he was getting on then. He's not with us anymore, sadly. And I just felt really touched because I thought he was saying goodbye. And as it was, that was the last time I saw him. And when I shook his hand, he suddenly, after we'd shaken hands, he pulled back and he said, "You should be careful doing that, Claire." And I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "You're only 2 handshakes away from Hitler," because he had held Hannah's hand, shaken Hannah's hand. And she, of course, had shaken the Führer's hand when she was given her Iron Cross. But it was quite sobering. It gave me pause for thought. This history isn't that far ago. And it's close to us, and the meaning is still very resonant and real. So that was interesting. But then I also managed to interview people on the other side of the war. So I interviewed a pilot with the Luftwaffe, who was actually an aerial reconnaissance pilot. That was fascinating. He told some very quite rude and naughty stories as well, that I don't know if we're going into that, but I mean, amazing stuff. There's a story about Mussolini's Willy, but I won't do it now, and which he witnessed. Anyhow, and then he also, but then I also interviewed various family members. So not so much with Hannah's family, who I suppose I understand. A lot of her papers are in various archives, but Melitta's family, I managed to get in touch with. And I went out to Germany, and there was some cousins of hers who very kindly said, well, come and meet us and we'll consider. And when I got to their lovely house on a lake, there were 3 chairs on one side of a table for them, and there was a stool on the other side for me. And I was basically interviewed for 2 hours. I was like, oh my God. They were lovely. They were really nice. And they went and they made coffee and cake and brought it back. They were lovely. But when they went into the kitchen the second time, I could hear them having a confab. And they came out and they said, yes, okay, we'd like to show you everything. We'll share. And they opened up their archive. And this was incredible because Melitta's papers, all the men that served, all the men that were involved in the Valkyrie bomb plot, their papers were put in military archives pretty much. Not all of them, but a lot of them were. Whereas hers, her diary, she kept a handwritten diary, 1943 and 1944. And all of it was returned to the family marked as domestic. And so nobody's seen it. And that's partly why she's fallen out. So to get this woman's story directly written down in her hand in sort of pencil, sometimes purple pencil, anyhow, was absolutely remarkable to have that from the family. And the other amazing interview I was lucky enough to get was I rang a chap called Berthold, a former general, and said, I'd love to come and interview you. And he said, well, I'm sorry. I'm very happy that you got in touch, but I've spoken about my father so often, I don't want to talk about him anymore. I've gone on the record. I've given lots of interviews. I said, that's fine. But actually, I'd really like to talk about your aunt, Melitta. And he said, nobody's ever asked me about my aunt before. I'm about to go away for 6 months, but why don't you come to Germany? So it's the only time I think I've virtually put the phone down, put knickers in a bag and went off to Germany. And I met him the next morning for breakfast and spent all day with him. And he was absolutely wonderful because these were sort of unrehearsed stories. And at the end of it, he kind of clicked his heels rather Prussian manner and shook my hand. And then he said, Claire, you should be careful shaking hands. And I just thought, oh gosh, here we go again. And he said, because you're just 2 handshakes away from Hitler, because he had held his father's hand and his father had shaken Hitler's hand. But now you have to remember that not everyone who shook hands with Hitler did so, enthusiastically. So his father, less than a week later, his father was Claus von Stauffenberg, tried to blow Hitler up. And it's got so close, the most famous attempt on Hitler's life in the war. And Melitta was right at the heart of that. And that story had never been told. So
you just said so much. First of all, I want to say I knew about Hannah Reitsch's helicopter flight indoors. I'm a helicopter pilot, so I knew of that. I hadn't read it before, so it was really wonderful to read it in that detail. But I'm curious about Melitta and whether, since you've published this book, anything has changed about her celebration in Germany. Has anything changed about the way people talk about her history?
Not as far as I know. Hannah's been quite well written about in the past. So she published her own memoirs, and there is an account of her flying the helicopter in that, if you're interested. And there's also Winkle Brown writes about it in his memoirs, which is called Wings on My Sleeve, and I can recommend that book too. So she's quite well known. But I would say that the more recent books on her, certainly the ones that I looked at, there was one that came out, I don't know, a few years before I was doing my research. So obviously I looked at that, and it seemed to present Hannah as a heroine. Basically was saying that Hannah was this extraordinary woman, which she was, a brilliant pilot, absolutely was. But she said, had she have been flying for the Allies, we'd all celebrate her as a heroine. But she's been reduced to this, terrible Nazi. But it's time to reevaluate her and take another perspective. So I went in with my mind open to that idea. I love women. I'm a feminist. I thought, great, if we can, if that is really the case, then we should reevaluate. But what I discovered in various archives, and I must say, because Hannah's family wouldn't or didn't respond to my letters, which is absolutely fair enough. But I did. Most of my papers are at the Deutsche Institutes, the Deutsche Archive in Munich. So I went there, and I think they've been quite carefully sort of gone through before they were donated. Well, that was interesting, but there was nothing that personal. There's a few interesting things. But then I got in touch with, because this is my second book in the Second World War, I know a couple of sort of what should we call memorabilia collectors type people. So I got in touch with them and said, does anyone have anything on Hannah Reitsch? And one chap very kindly said, well, actually, I've got these letters from the 1970s, right towards the end of her life, that she was writing to an English friend who he had bought them from. And he said he'd be happy for me to have a look. So I didn't hold them, but he just photocopied them and sent that. And it was remarkable because here in the 1970s, she was writing unguardedly. She never thought these letters would be published. But now they are in the public domain through my book, really. They hadn't been seen before. And what it showed was how deeply anti-Semitic, how horrendously racist she was. And that she had never, though she published her memoirs, she never took the opportunity to say, I didn't know anything at the time of what was going on with Nazi policy, and now I can see what a terrible thing it was and I was exploited. She never said any of that. She remained, Eric Brown, who knew her well, told me she was, this is his words, a fanatical Nazi. And she absolutely was. So, you can be a brilliant pilot, and a number of people have told me how beautiful she is. That's in the eye of the beholder, isn't it? But you can be beautiful, you can be a brilliant pilot, you can be incredibly brave. And she definitely was a courageous flyer. But you can also be an anti-Semitic, racist Nazi, and she was. And we need to tell all of women's stories. We need to remember that as well. But of course, Melitta provides the perfect foil for that.
Absolutely. I agree. And, I think that was what was most fascinating about these women, is that they are complex characters, and these are not cardboard cutouts. And I love the way that you presented them, the way that you revealed their motivations and their roles. It was so fabulously done. This book is so important, and I'm so grateful to you for writing it. You talked about the Eglantine book, but you didn't have a chance to talk about the second one, The Spy Who Loved. Do you want to talk about that book too?
I'd written my first book, and amazingly it won a prize. So I thought, well, I must capitalize on this and do another one, but I had no idea what to write about. So my agent said, well, what are your interests? And I was like, well, I think there's a lot of women's stories that have either been untold or they've been told through this prism of beauty and courage rather than achievement and being effective. So I was interested in that. And I was interested in Polish history because as part of my first degree, I'd studied Polish sort of modern history and politics. And they have this incredibly rich, well, I call it rich, but it's been devastating history, but very courageous and inspiring history as well, because of where they are geographically in Europe. So they buffer Soviet territory on one hand and, the West. And so I'd actually taught English out in Poland for a little while, many years ago. So I was very interested in all of that. And my agent actually suggested Christina Skarbek, or Christine Granville, as she was known in Britain, the name that it was actually a code name of hers that she adopted after the war. And I said no, because I felt it was a bit like going on a blind date. I wanted to find my own book subject, thank you very much, not be offered one. But I thought, to be polite, because I was so amazed I had an agent, I should just go off and do a little bit of research. And like just about anyone who came across Christina, I was completely seduced by her. She's just such a fantastic, fantastic, inspirational woman. Not without her faults, which I love about her as well, but strident and powerful. And the book is called The Spy Who Loved because she was a very passionate woman, and she loved men. She had 2 husbands. She had many lovers, all of whom are in the book. She loved adventure and adrenaline. The British minister in Budapest, who knew her well, said she had a pathological love of danger, he said. So what's not to like about that? And then, but above all, she loved freedom and independence, by which I mean both freedom for her country, Poland, and for Britain, the country, her adopted country that she directly served in the war, and for all of the Allies against, the Nazi advance, but also freedom for herself personally. And when I was reading or finding out about her story, I just wanted to be more dynamic, to seize life more powerfully and to be more passionate in every regard. And I just thought, oh, okay, this is something that really needs to be told.
That's fabulous that they brought you something that you fell in love with. I cannot wait to read this book. Congratulations on your success with all of your books.
Thank you so much.
Do you have any leads on the next project?
Well, I have just written a book proposal, but I'm not going to talk about it in case the publishers don't go for it. It's not gone out yet. I'm waiting. I've got a couple of things I just need to finish on it. So that's nearly done, but that's just a proposal. If a publisher decides to go for it, I've then got to start the 3 years work of doing it. I'm a very slow writer because I fit it around kids and life. So, and apart from that, yes, I'm just very busy. I'm doing some TV at the moment. Obviously, book reviews and the book prize. So it's all going on. Yeah.
It's lovely. Well, I'm just going to wrap up the book club portion of this by saying thanks again for writing this book and thanks for your time. You definitely have a huge fan club now, so I appreciate it. And these women were just incredible. So thank you for memorializing them.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all your readers as well. Thank you.
Thank you for listening, and thank you Coming Home Well for your collaboration in helping these stories reach a broader audience. Writing is a deeply healing and cathartic exercise. It can help you process your experiences, whether you intend to share them with the world or keep them to yourself. Living the experiences of others through reading can also help heal, validate, and create a sense of connectedness. If you're interested in hearing about how these authors brought their stories to life on the page, check out the Writer's Room interviews on the Aviatrix book review website and podcast. If you'd like to join the book club conversations, look for the Aviatrix Book Club on Facebook. All are welcome. And connect with me on social media at Literary Aviatrix. I'd love to hear from you. Blue skies and happy reading.